Hello, everyone. Happy to be here once again to host another episode of The Loft, a podcast sponsored by NJCDC and our Great Falls Youth Center, coming to you from Paterson, New Jersey. I'm Bob Garashi, CEO of NJCDC. Over the last many months, we've been proud to team up with our friends from the New Jersey Department of Community Affairs to provide important information on a variety of topics affecting people here in Paterson, but also throughout the state. Today, we have the pleasure of welcoming our friends from DCA, Kaya King and Michael Callahan, who will discuss the Bringing Veterans Home initiative and what the state is doing to help tackle the problem of homelessness amongst our veterans. With that, I'm happy to turn it over to Kaya to begin our discussion today. Kaya?
Good to see you, Bob.
Good to see you.
Happy spring. I know it's been a couple months, I think, since we've been able to get together for community conversations. So excited to be back.
Absolutely.
So Mike, great to have you again.
Thanks, Guy.
I know last time we had talked, it was back in the fall. And for folks, just as a reminder, Mike Callahan is our director over the Office of Homelessness Prevention in the state of New Jersey within the Department of Community Affairs. His work has been essential to the department and really the state's efforts to address homelessness in a way that's intentional, holistic, and is really done with the goal that we're going to try to end it in a way that's going to really work with the networks that are in place in the communities that we're serving. And Mike has been a critical part of understanding that landscape and making sure that we navigate it in a really thoughtful way. So I know, Mike, we were together back in the fall, which I think was a perfect time, right, to kind of share a bit about what the office was doing, especially I think where that impact happens for a lot of folks who are right now either in homelessness or in imminent danger of homelessness in the state. I wanted to make sure that we had a special episode with you, Mike, because I think when people think about homelessness, it's a very macro concept. It's a discomforting concept. I think we talked about that last, and you were able to really, I think, bring people back to grounding with the data, with some perspective, and I think some ways, in a lot of sense, of dismantling some of the bias around this work. But one of the initiatives that I think has been so transformative that we wanted to focus on today has been the Bringing Veterans Home initiative. And to me, that feels like a really important entry point for the state to really make a dedicated commitment to working through homelessness prevention and looking at such a critical and essential population. So wanted to start off first, I think, hearing from you, Mike, about really what the Bringing Veterans Home initiative is and what are the main goals?
Sure. So the Bringing Veterans Home initiative is the state's effort to bring veteran homelessness through the state, but also to, more importantly, National Guard homelessness and reservist homelessness in the state. Down to what's called functional zero. So what that means is that the number of veterans and those other two populations that I just talked about are homeless at any given time in the state of New Jersey, right, are never exceeds, right, the number of that same population that can be housed within 30 days, right? The second objective is to, through that, right, with that first one, is to really achieve this landscape of homelessness being rare, brief, and non-reoccurring, right? Those three kind of benchmarks. When you look at both the literature and just kind of the state of practice right now, the idea of homelessness is rare and brief really leads to kind of those generational outcomes that we look to achieve, particularly when we look at veterans. It's also post 9/11 veterans within that generational cohort, right? So beyond that too, one of the things that we're also looking to achieve is, from a policy perspective, getting past some of the jurisdictional and other limitations which have kind of inhibited this large state-led multi-jurisdictional effort to get past the idea of conceptualizing the point of intervention as the continuum of care at a county level, or the county HISAC, or the regional or regional loose-based coalition, or a nonprofit that is leading a collaborative of organizations collectively. It is very much an all-in approach, and most importantly, it also leverages the strengths of our federal partners, but also to making up for the weaknesses there. Simultaneously, it leverages the strengths of our municipal and smaller echelon of government nonprofits, but our partners rather. Then also making up for, right, also to here at the state, right, well, there's a lot of things that we do really well. And there's a lot of things we don't do really well. Mm-hmm. And similarly, our community-based organization landscape, but also to that of the veteran service organization landscape. So essentially, it's in a matrix style, getting past, so everybody is operating with their strengths, and we're making up for those deficiencies along the system to reach that endpoint.
I think you brought up some important points there, Mike. And one of the things, and I know you had kind of noted some expanded category, National Guard reservists. I think that's one of the several exceptional features about this program. Can you just share with our audience members a bit, why that inclusion, especially when we look at veterans and how we're defining that, is why this program, I think, is also exceptional when you even look at national comparisons for addressing veteran homelessness?
Sure. So, there's more than a couple states and the District of Columbia that have reached that functional 0 point, right? There's 5 if you count DC, even though DC is not a state. Then there's 4, right, that have achieved that benchmark already. And so when we look at that, right, it is really, that has been leveraging primarily as the quarterback role federal resources. And what's dependent upon federal resources is the federal statutory and CFR definition of what a veteran is, and what that veteran eligibility also drives what type of services they are. Like there's certain discharge categories or certain reentry codes that are eligible for a subsection of services, right, within the Veterans Administration, but not all, right? And because of that, right, sometimes when we look at those folks that can be most adversely impacted, right, because of their service, or the characterization of that service, right, they're more than likely to be and enter into homelessness because of either those experiences or kind of the second and third order effects of those experiences when they served. But they're excluded, right, because of the way that statute is set up, right? And so in conceptualizing this, kind of when we hatched it, we created this big huge Venn diagram of, all right, let's go and see where the gaps are with the federal definition of veteran that are eligible for homelessness services, and making sure that if we're using federal dollars that we can maximize them for that population segment, and then look at the state statutory definition of veteran, which is very complex, actually, somewhat more complex than the federal definition of veteran. And then we overlaid that. But then importantly, when we kind of pitched this and we were just right sizing it and scaling it, we also decided to engage with General Howe at the time, who was the Adjutant General, right, of DMAVA, and going and saying, hey, what if we also do this for National Guard members? And so importantly, New Jersey National Guard members, and it's a small subset, right? But there's quite a few New Jersey National Guard members that don't have what's called Title X service, right, for active duty, or they only have active duty for training, meaning that when they went to boot camp, if they went to advanced individual training, if they went to a school or something, or some professional development, right? Even though they might have gone to an active duty schoolhouse or engaged in, they were being paid as an active duty service member at that time, it was only for training purposes. So what that means is that if that New Jersey National Guard member was never federalized and never engaged in, saying, a deployment to Iraq or Syria or Africa or something like that, then they may have served 22 years in the New Jersey National Guard and be retiring as a command sergeant major, and they may have responded to every single disaster in the state of New Jersey. But if they're sleeping in their car because they don't meet that threshold, right, for federal service, they're excluded from the federal definition of homelessness services. And so since we're using primarily state dollars for this effort, we thought, yeah, well, that's a great population to dovetail into this so that they're not excluded. And we could really put forth that if you were in New Jersey and you served for any other reason but dishonorable, right, if there's any other characterization of your service but dishonorable service, right, then if you were homeless, we're going to help you get housed.
That's an incredible point. And I think something that, when we talk about barriers, especially for veterans, I don't think people understand that nuance, right? Sometimes it's, people don't want to think about how things are kind of written, but that matters. That matters with our program execution. And, that's a pretty significant barrier that you and the team at DCA are trying to make sure is not, going to prevent access. Can you share a little bit? I think we've obviously gotten into the pen and paper a bit about this program, and I want to hear a bit about the action items that you and the team have already kind of executed so far and where that's going. But from your vantage and expertise, what are some of the other challenges that you've observed for homeless veterans in New Jersey that they're facing, especially the need for this type of program?
Yeah, sure. So one of the main key challenges, I'd say in my view, is that the overlay of the current risk structure, but also to the distribution of those high risk places in New Jersey that have high densities and concentrations of veterans, particularly for post 9/11 veterans, and also too with aging out Vietnam era veterans, Cold War era veterans, is that it doesn't really fit nicely with our existing homelessness prevention and services ecosystem, right? So where, even though in large urban settings, because of things like economic conscription and things like that, where you're more than likely to be recruited out of high school to go enter into the Marine Corps or the Army, if you go to Eastside High School versus if you went to Del Barton, right? Even though that's a reality, when we look at the distribution of veterans across the state and where they're living post-service, right? The northwest part of the state and the southeastern part of the state, there's really high densities, right? And because of that, right, when folks are unsheltered, right, they most often are in places where, only 2 years ago when we stood up our rural and suburban street outreach program, the only unsheltered street outreach program that you could potentially have in a county was the PATH program through DHS, right? And so there's really 2 people, right? So a PATH team of 2 people that are responsible for an entire landscape prior to that of doing so. And because of that, one of the things that we did with this is, okay, from just modeling the consumer journey, right? So I'm a veteran. I'm a veteran. I walk into a VFW bar in Long Valley, New Jersey, right? So out in Western Morris County. Right. I go to that VFW and I walk in and I say, hey, you know what? Right. Pony up to the bar and just call me Private Joe Snuffy, just for the sake of illustration. And say, hey, you know what? I'm here. Right. Here's my DD-214. I'm definitely a veteran. I can prove to you I am. I'm even a VFW member. But do you mind if I sleep in my car tonight in your parking lot? Right. Because it's a safe place. And I know you guys won't kick me out, but there's no really a place else to go and for me to go and sleep overnight without parking in a Walmart parking lot, even though you can't really even do that anymore, without getting harassed by the cops or anything else going on, right? And in doing so, right, it's understanding that, hey, if we don't have unsheltered street outreach teams and workers to go and respond in that moment, to go and meet that moment where the folks are, or alternatively, say they're living in the woods in an encampment, right, with some other veterans or some other folks that are experiencing unsheltered homelessness up in High Point, right, further up there in Sussex, right, in the woods where nobody's really bothering them, nobody's seeing what's going on. Folks are going to work every day and they're just working towards trying to get enough money to get back on their feet and get an apartment, right? Unless you actually have the mobile teams that are going to go out and search for where folks are, or to go and work with that local VFW or that local American Legion folks to be like, hey, what's going on? If we have a relationship, we've got this program, we want to go and be engaged and see where you're at so we can stabilize folks. That is, and be like, oh, hey, Joe Snuffy was here the other night and he was sleeping in his car, but he lives in the woods out behind Wendy's, right? That can then, instead of having to go, oh, hey, here's a card, have him go and call us next time. It's okay, cool. That team then goes in the woods and goes looking for Joe Snuffy, right? And they're trained. It's not non-professional outreach. It's very much everybody who's doing this work is not only paid a thriving wage, but it's with intentionality for hiring folks that are going to be able to respond to folks that if they're actively in crisis or something else like that, they can also triage and make that happen.
Right. What I love about this approach is that it's, again, we've talked about government kind of showing up to people, right? This whole flipping this paradigm of we're government, and if you want something, come find us, almost. And I was saying like, no, we're going to do a better job about making this as convenient and streamlined. And we'll get into, I think, more of the mechanics about this, Mike, which I think is what makes this so transformative and brilliant, because this is about relying on the tailored and specific populations and the people that understand it in those areas and can serve those folks, right? Which brings in that trust value add, which I know we'll talk about. So I want to make note too, right, for folks that don't know about this program, right? This was, an administration's effort under Governor Murphy and the legislature to make sure that this was funded. And so $30 million was provided under the budget for this program. Can you talk a little bit, Mike, about that money? And I think when people hear $30 million, they're like, whoa, oh my goodness, that's a fair amount. But it's a great sum, but I know we have to make those dollars work. And I wanted to hear from you, how has the execution been to just make sure that that funding is really going to where it needs to get us to hit our goal?
Yeah. So importantly, one of the things that we did in not only scoping that budget ask was going and seeing, okay, what are the federal dollars that we're receiving at the state level that we can kind of optimize to go towards the actual housing part, which is often the most expensive part, right? So there's like $9.5 million in home ARP money that we're leveraging for this, which are federal dollars. Then within SRAP, right, one of the really cool things is that within the state rental assistance program, there is a statutory preference for veterans. Because there's a statutory preference for veterans and the language was supportive of that, we were able to use additional SRAP vouchers with the current allocation that we're using for this year, right, for the housing voucher. And what that did, it freed up that $30 million then to us to have maximum flexibility with. And so what we did was we met with our partners from, there's 3 different VAs that service New Jersey. There's VA New Jersey, VA Philadelphia, and VA Delaware, right? And so we met with all of them, and I have a really good understanding, and a lot of the OHP team has a really good understanding of the SSVF program, so the support services for veteran families, the grant per diem program, the homeless veteran reintegration program, which are all federal programs,
right,
that are ran through VA. But we really kind of created this huge matrix of, okay, this is what these cover in these areas, right? And this is what is not covered, right? And these are, hey, our federal partners always said these are nice to haves that we'd always love to do, right? But there wasn't necessarily the support and any bipartisan effort at the federal level to go and effectuate either those changes to those programs or to kind of pilot a couple things, right, outside of these small grants. And so what we did was say, okay, like we just talked about the previous example, unsheltered street outreach is something that SSVF programs and those other federal programs that are already servicing New Jersey can do in a very small, limited capacity, but why don't we do it in a robust capacity, right? So one of the things that we did with that 30 million is we said, okay, let's go and instead of that linear journey or that quasi-linear journey of someone going from unhoused to housed, right? Let's see where we can add value to that and increase, right, not only time to execution and time to housing, right? So really that's a decrease actually because you're decreasing days, right? But also to expand the workforce where any investment that we're making through BVH with state dollars can actually be replicated or transitioned into other state funds or other state programs because we're designing them to go and do so, right? And so one of that is it's a net savings longitudinally over 5 or 10 years because we're not creating these jobs where, okay, it's going to be a $30 million budget ask every year into perpetuity.
Right.
It is very much a, hey, these jobs fit into, say, the New Jersey Family Care Housing Supports Program that's just rolling out as a tenancy sustainment case manager. Okay, great. Now let's work with the grantees or our vendors to go and make sure that, hey, if and when BVH ever ends, there's a seamless transition into that, right? And what that looks like. And so importantly, it's not just the point of service, but it's also ensuring that the people who are working in these jobs, right, also have longevity. And we're creating, instead of this loss of institutional knowledge that happens with a lot of grant cycle-based programs,
right,
we're retaining that and making sure that, hey, we're actually building a bench and a workforce that understands the kind of dynamics of, oh, just because you worked on a veteran homeless program doesn't mean you're stuck in that small subsegment within homelessness in its totality, or even housing insecurity in its totality. And so moving beyond that and really looking at working with our federal partners, working with stakeholders. One of the things that came up in engaging with the governor's Veterans Council and with some of the persons with lived experience was some of the veterans persons with lived experience groups that we were working with is that originally as we conceptualized the program, it was the hotline and text-based kind of self-referral was there, but it was kind of this overwhelming engagement, both from the veteran service organizations that we were engaging with, the Governor's Veterans Council, but also to these other groups, right, of just one-on-one conversations that we want mental health support to be available as part of, if I'm calling to say I'm homeless, I also want to be able to talk to a crisis counselor. And that doesn't exist right now for a homeless hotline in the state. And in doing so, that was going back to DMAVA and, much to Deputy Commissioner Solomeno's credit, right? He really made this happen, right? And is going and saying, hey, we can work with our partners at Vet to Vet to go do this. So importantly, if you're calling Vet to Vet to say, hey, I'm experiencing homelessness and I'm living in the woods in Cumberland County, New Jersey, right? And I'm also having a really bad time and I need to talk to somebody. You can do it on the same phone call, have the same referrals happen and the same process happen all at the same point. So you're reducing the number of touch points somebody has to go do in order to get help.
Which would increase really the measure of success in the back end. Right.
Mike, you mentioned Vet to Vet, and we're fortunate to have veteran service organizations here in New Jersey. So, what role do they play in all of this, and how does your office work with them?
Sure. So importantly, the VSO orgs, when we were doing the design phase of this and the scoping was, going to the veteran of foreign wars, going to the American Legions, going to the Jewish war veterans, going to the disabled American veterans, going to some of the other smaller but no less important VSO organizations, saying, hey, how can we fit what we're doing into total alignment with what you're supporting from a private philanthropy perspective, right, of veterans experiencing homelessness? And so for many of them, it was, oh, hey, it'd be really great if we could shift costs from paying for an emergency hotel stay, right, for a weekend for folks, right, in order to go and say, hey, we might facilitate that connection, but it'd be really better if us as a VFW or American Legion could pivot those private funds that we're raising into housing production. If we can go and think about, okay, how do we really solve homelessness? We build homes, right? And or maybe we master lease a couple apartments and make them available to folks that are going through this program, right? And that's really what the upshot of those conversations were. It was, look, we are stuck in this crisis response because we are very mission driven to do so, right? But there's successful pilots out there like New Jersey SOS Vets, right? The Veteran Stakeholders Group that Dave Pearson and AJ Luna run, right? And to be able to go and say, hey, right, how do we also ingrain all of these CBOs that are going to be doing this work with the weekly operations of what's going on? And how do we create this feedback and accountability mechanism, right? Where it's not one of the hardest things, and let me just backtrack. One of the hardest things to do in government, in my view, is no matter what you do, you're always wrong. Does that make sense? Right.
Yes.
And because no matter what you do, you're always wrong, or it's, like I could have housed 65,000 people last year, but because I didn't house 65,000 in one.
There are always critics.
Right. Yeah. And that's okay.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Like that's, I think it was Biden that said your job as a public servant is just to get yelled at or something like that and do it with grace and poise instead of, anyway, just understanding that, right, is, one of the things that we've done through this is we've also partnered with it's not a case management platform, but it's a place where work happens called Civic Roundtable, right? And through that, right, as long as you are formally a part of this effort, right, you are participating on Civic Roundtable where the day-to-day actions of everything that's going on is happening. Right. So it's instead of having to email somebody and then the time to execution and time to resolvement, right, of flagging that initial issue, right, is maybe 3 to 4 hours, right? We're getting stuff troubleshooted and fixed within 5 minutes, within 7 minutes. So people are going on this platform, going and typing in, hey, right, I'm Mike Callahan and I'm the vice president of the Cranford American Legion Hall, right? And that, we use the BVH referral link, but say Bridges Outreach, who's covers Cranford, New Jersey, right, within that region, right, they haven't been responsive, right? Even in that hypothetical situation right there, which is, I changed the names of some of the actors because that actually was, right? It was resolved within 3 minutes. And it wasn't a, hey, let me go call the news media, or hey, let me go figure this out. It was, hey, how can we engage in these problem solving conversations that we build community around where we can have high trust because we're demanding accountability and action across all of our partners.
That's awesome. And I mean, that's a really, really good story about how the initiative is working. And, as it's been unfolding, are there any other examples of maybe what was a particularly challenging problem that came to your attention and an inspirational way in which it was handled? Any reports from the field about how this program is working?
Oh, yeah, sure. So there was a veteran that was in Morris County that was on Fox News, actually.
Okay.
Right. So rightly so, right. There was a community activist group, right? Morris County has a very strong activist community, particularly around veterans. There's a community activist group that, for whatever reason, right, a veteran had a negative encounter with that county veteran service office, right? And oftentimes, right, it's the truth is somewhere in the middle about what actually happened, right? But regardless and irrespective of that, right, the advocate thought that escalating it to the news media was the appropriate channel for some resolution of the housing instability and crisis, right? It was an 80-year-old veteran, right? One of the problems is that the gentleman's service history was lost in the VA fire, which is pretty, if you have a service record prior to, I believe it's 1971, there's a really defined window that I don't remember at this point, but importantly, the paper copy of you actually, the official government record copy of you serving in the military was actually lost in a fire.
Oh, wow.
Right. And so there are ways that the VA has done to reconcile that. Right. But one of the things that we've done through the BVH program is we assume presumptive eligibility. Right. And simultaneously, right, we have electronic systems and some other systems that we're not only able to almost instantaneously validate someone's veteran status, right, if from a federal level, but importantly, right, one of the things that we also do is, hey, if it's going to take 4 weeks to go and resolve the question of are you veteran enough, right, for federal benefits, but there is a preponderance of evidence that goes and points to, right, that yes, you in fact are a veteran, right, we serve you, we make it happen. Right. And importantly, you know, what that comes from is our office also funds a bunch of non-veteran homelessness programs too. Right. So if we put somebody in a hotel, if we rapidly rehouse them using BVH resources, and it turns out at the end of the day, no, that wasn't it, then we have other resources that we can cost share to offset that. So we make sure the BVH resources are really tied in for veterans, right, or for those National Guard members. But even beyond that, going back to the story, right, this gentleman went, and there was actually a Fox, there was the reporter, kind of as a courtesy, right, before they were about to do the interview, flagged it for Damava, right? So called our good friend Vincent, yes, right, and his team, right, and says, hey, just so you know, this is about to be a thing, right, where we go and say that, you know, this veteran sought services, or we're not unable to access them, going to the county office in Morristown. Well, we get it, and we say, oh, well, we can actually fix this right now, right? And really, it was a simple case, and I don't want to minimize the trauma that the gentleman was experienced, but really, they were 3 months in arrears, right? They were about to be housed. The veteran had a history of sleeping in his car, right? Prior to that, getting that stable housing, the family member was working with them and about to kind of move in with his dad, right, to make sure that the veteran doesn't return to homelessness if that's what happens, and then I call him up, and then I say, hey, what's going on? What's the actual story? And the Fox 5 reporter is right there, right? And it's a conversation that's live. It's actually on tape someplace. Right? We assess the situation. We would say, hey, you know what? We can leverage bringing veterans home diversion funding to resolve your arrears, right? And we're going to go and make sure that we can lease you in place, right, with one of the programs that's available through bringing veterans home. And then we resolved that veterans housing crisis right there. And while the near-term solution took less than 1 hour of phone calls back and forth, right, in order to secure that housing and to stabilize it, right, the case resolves within 3 weeks, wow, which is great.
Yeah. I mean, you know, we've all heard of stories where it's taking months and months and months. So that's really a great outcome. So under BVH, there are regional hubs. And can you talk about those hubs and, you know, the role that they play in coordinating services and making the system work?
Oh, sure. So one of the issues in homelessness in the state writ large is that we have this sea of goodwill, to kind of really bastardize a quote from General Petraeus from back in the day. We have the sea of goodwill and only islands of competency. Right. And that's a function of a lot of different things. Right. And so Kai alluded to the complexity that is housing insecurity and homelessness in the state. And one of the things is, you know, if you conceptualize homelessness from a HUD perspective, right, so housing and urban development, right, the unit of change where change happens is the continuum of care, right? And there's 16 continuums of care, right, in the state of New Jersey, right? If you conceptualize homelessness from the VA perspective, right, then what really drives that is the VISN system, or the Veteran Integrated Service Network system. Right. And so that's where VA healthcare and all the kind of sub-agencies that fall under that VA healthcare umbrella, right, all coordinate and act as a regional basis. Right. And so one of the things that we wanted to also solve for is you also have 21 counties in New Jersey. Every single county in New Jersey also has its own veteran service office. Right. And oftentimes, right, what's happening in the veteran service office is not happening in that county board of social services or something else like that. And that's not a function of ill will or anything else like that. It just, they're seen as two distinct kind of orbits. Yeah. Right. So understanding all that, right, going that cross-jurisdictional collaboration, one of the things that we also need to do is instead of approximating, we need to have in real time what the actual number of veterans experiencing homelessness is. Right. So if you look at the reports that come from our office or from the department or from DMAVA, right, or even the PIT count, right, it's always this either longitudinal or cross-sectional census of saying, okay, on X date, there were Y number of veterans that were homeless. right? And that's for the PIT count. If you look at some of the reports that we put out, over the course of a calendar year, X number of veterans were homeless, X number of veterans were at risk of homelessness, and X number of veterans were in Z permanent housing programs. That's usually how we do it, right? And when we talk about a policy response, those data sets are helpful, right? But still at the end of the day, you're still talking about outputs. You're not talking about outcomes and like real-time based measurements to be able to model off of. Right. And so one of the greatest things about this effort is, and how the jurisdictional process drives this through, or the cross-jurisdictional process through regional hubs drives this is, right, it's getting with all sources of data within that region of being able to deduplicate across many different systems and also to many different actors. You go and say, hey, if, Rich Uniac from Bridges Outreach is saying, well, his organization has a current active caseload of 25 veterans, right? But VA is reporting through the continuum of care coordinated entry system in Union County on their by name list that there's 17 veterans, but they're operating in the same county. We want to be able to know what is the actual number and what does that look like. And we also want to make sure that the veterans that Rich is serving at Bridges Outreach are being seen by VA healthcare. And that they know about that. And then all the partners in this effort, right, on a regional basis, because really, you can't scale that too large, and then becomes all of a sudden communication overhead overload.
How many counties does a regional hub typically cover?
Right. So it depends. It's population dependent.
Okay.
Right. So there's 6 regional hubs, right? The smallest regional hub is Region 2, I believe. And so that's just Essex and Union County. Right. Then we have larger regional hubs, right? So there's Region 3, which is one of our largest regions, right? And that is that's where we're talking about the northwestern part of the state.
Okay.
Right. And also too, with that is the amount of resources and the type of resources. While everybody has the same baseline, right? Part of this is through that regionalization process. It's, hey, Region 3, because rents are a little higher, might need more rapid rehousing assistance, and we might need to be more elastic with how we're deploying rapid rehousing dollars and what that looks like, versus a lower cost of living area, say in Region 5, right? We might have to prioritize, because the distribution of unsheltered veterans, right? Some additional street outreach funding to help the grantees in those areas being able to staff up more appropriately, and then to kind of see in real time. So what the regional process does is, instead of us going and saying, okay, this is the program, this is the guide, this is what it looks like, right? We're able to go and in real time pivot and say, okay, it looks like over the next 30 days, we need to be able to surge this resource to this grantee. And one of the good things is that part of this is also the boring stuff on the back end, right? Where it's not just how it's happening in the regions, but because we have these regional grantees, our internal business processes of the department have been refined now, where we can amend, or we can revise a budget, or amend a grant and deploy additional funding, or categorize things differently with an approval process normally under 2 weeks.
That's
right.
great.
And so what that does is it doesn't leave our nonprofit partners that are doing the yeoman's part of this work holding the bag for anything.
That's
right?
great.
So,
Yeah. You mentioned earlier the example of the gentleman who got on Fox News, and in so doing brought attention to his situation. But there've got to be a lot of veterans who just may not have an advocate to help them, don't have resources, may not have access to transportation. How are we helping the veterans who are maybe the most hidden and who may need the most help, but just aren't being seen?
Yeah, so particularly those unsheltered street outreach teams, right?
Okay.
We've effectively tripled the number of street outreach teams in the state, right? And with the population focus, right, it is very much if you're unsheltered, and one of the great things about just the veteran system of care as a whole in its totality is that we don't put limits on for our street outreach workers on saying, okay, say you were going in the woods, right? Say, what's that one park up here? I always forget. It's really nice.
You have Garrett Mountain.
Garrett Mountain, right? So Garrett Mountain. Say for whatever reason someone was living in the woods in Garrett Mountain, right? You could go and CSB&J, who's the grantee for Region 1 here, right? Right, is able to go and not only engage with that individual in the woods, but they say, hey, you know what? That's great right now. I can't walk out of the woods right now because I have diabetes that's untreated, and like I have all this necrotic stuff on my flesh. a street outreach worker says, hey, doesn't have to say, hey, that's not my lane. That street outreach worker can go with them to the ED at the VA East Orange, or go with them to the ED at VA Lyons, right? Or someplace else if they want healthcare there, or if they want to just be seen in the regular system of care, they can do it. There's no separation stop. Okay, this is where our unsheltered street outreach and intensive case management stops. Mm-hmm. It's in fact, you're not, and importantly, right, that's usually where you see a touch point of, okay, this is when loss of service happens. It's, hey, you took me to the ED, but now hospital social work guy has you, and here's my card. Make sure the attending or somebody else calls me before they release you. Right.
Sure.
It's no, that's great. You're stabilized. You're good. Now let's go get you in a hotel placement or a shelter placement for the night.
What happens when the problem is not physical health, but mental health? And I think you touched on this earlier. How quickly are you able to get help to someone who's in an acute mental health crisis? Sure.
So one of the prerequisites for all the street outreach teams, right, is that not only do they have mental health first aid training, but importantly that because there's also a veteran flavor of that that's through Mental Health America. That's and MHA New Jersey does a great job with shout out to Ruth if she's listening. They do a great job with training folks on that. But importantly, right, say they are in acute crisis. Right. It's not that street outreach worker is going to be issuing the CSSRS and going down checkpoints and stuff like that. But importantly, they're not making a clinical decision. They're making hey, it sounds like you need help. Let's go and let's talk to an active crisis counselor, or let's go and get you the psychiatric help that you need right now. Right. And then kind of folds into the existing system. And part of this is we've forced all of our vendors throughout this process to be able to articulate in their applications, okay, that is a question you have to answer. What is the process by which you do it if a veteran is in an acute mental health crisis during that engagement, right? And, during the scoring process, it was very apparent, right? Sure. What agencies and entities are able to deal with that, and what entities where, while they are very well-meaning, right, aren't necessarily to be prepared for the breadth of what they might be engaging with.
Got it. Thank you.
Okay.
Mike, you've touched on so many, I think, important things about not just this initiative, but this population in particular, right? Our veterans of New Jersey that we owe, I think a debt to, and this is one of the ways that we can start to make up for it. But what's so impressive to me about this program too, and I think you've touched on it, is that we're utilizing this process to really be building bricks as we walk the path, and letting this be an important litmus test of where we have programmatic improvement. And then also, I think to your point of what you had just said, even just now, like the layering of services. And I think taking away kind of the one-dimensional nature that maybe folks have about homelessness, right? In general, whether you're talking about veteran population or anyone that's facing that risk. But one of the things I think I find transformative about this program is that you're a big person on measuring. Right.
Yeah.
Which is one of I think the great points of what we've been able to evolve for the department. And I think, Bob, we've talked about this, right? Like,
sure.
How are we really looking at success points, but even that data around it? And, I think certainly we know real life outcome in our success is knowing that we're going to get folks, to functional zero, or get the state in that place and people housed. But besides, which again is I think the most seminal, right? That human impact. But how are we, I think, going to take this program and what's been started and figure out what's going to be the measure of success, right? How are we going to say, wow, this really worked well? And what can we take to kind of copy a bit, I think, as we look at programmatic success and maybe could propagate in other programs, right, that affect our homeless population in New Jersey.
Which is really important, too, when it comes to sustaining funding.
Right.
Because those outcomes have to be clearly documented and articulated in order, we talked about the department just having to go before the budget committee.
That's right.
Outcomes are important.
Yeah. We've got to do our homework. And Mike, you're one of the best at that. So curious your thoughts on it.
Yeah. So one of the hardest parts of engaging in any type of measurement framework or just quality assurance with nonprofit partners or anyone in general, right? It doesn't matter if it's somebody you employ or somebody just your spouse or your partner, right? Is not only that's great that you have those signals that are going to generate and engender some feedback, right? But also how do you deliver that, right? And so one of the things we kind of moved away from is now that we've socialized with, our portfolio of grantees and other folks that we do business with, hey, we look at everything and we measure everything, right? It's assuring them that doesn't mean that you're going to be cut off from funding if you do a bad job.
Right.
It means that we're going to use these KPIs, so key performance indicators, but also to OKRs, right? Objectives and key results, to go and improve collaboratively together to serve that mission end, right? And really like staying true to that word and going and saying, to be able to go and talk to Victor Luna, CEO of CSB&J, and say, that's great that you've seen, right, that we have our BVH dashboard, which should be live to the public, hopefully here pretty soon, right? But being able to say, that's great that, you've accepted 105 referrals, right? But as it looks like right now, the time to delivery for first contact and recording that first contact, right, is at 31 hours right now, right? And the baseline expectation of, if you're doing this program contractually, is within 24 hours, there's live documentation, right? And with that, right, it's okay, so walk through me what the blocker is on that, right? And it's not coming from okay, you didn't do this, I'm taking your money away. Right. It's coming from a place of, oh, hey, it looks like the way that you've been really struggling with some data quality staffing, or right, it looks like the 3 people that were key to your team left, and you can't backfill those positions, right? And it's going and saying, okay, well, if those are the structural deficits in your organization, how can we work collaboratively across partners to go and do so? Maybe we can subcontract with another nonprofit. Maybe we can work with a employment agency to go and find it. Maybe we partner with a local university, right? It's engaging in that creative problem solving, just like we do with somebody who might be sleeping in the woods,
right?
To go and figure out, okay, here's the problem, but the problem is the problem. The person is not the problem, or the organization isn't the problem, right? And I think with that, it's understanding and getting with folks that, hey, being coachable is a skill and it's something you can learn, right? And simultaneously, it's also that lets us here at the department also figure out, okay, well, if there's somebody on my team that is actually precipitating all of these things, right? We're getting signal of that, right? So instead of somebody calling their state senator or state assembly person to be like, oh, Mike at DCA is like crunching about numbers again, right? Or
they
not.
do say that a lot.
Yeah, I know. It's importantly, it's saying, look, this is a relationship that we have to have, and we have to do this together. This is not something where the state is a passive entity where you give us outputs and tell me how many widgets you created, and I give you money to do so. Right. This is very much something that is evolving in real time. And just as we expect that data to be reported in real time and performance to be able to be measurable in real time, we also expect a relationship to change and evolve in real time. Yeah. Right. And oftentimes, people won't characterize government like that. And it's very much a facet of, I believe, through, your leadership and the commissioner's leadership, that, we're here to do business with you. Yes. Right. And that also too, in a very constrained funding environment, we need a return on every single dollar we spend. Yeah. And we need to be able to justify that return.
I love some of those points because, and you tied it back, right? The same compassion point and approach we're taking with the people we're serving, right? Our homeless vets, of understanding the entire circumstance. We're doing that with our grantees. And I think it's really important to, you had touched on this, right? When we look at data and measurables and getting that back, right? It doesn't have to be punitive. Sometimes it's an early detection system. And sometimes we've got incredible grantees that want to do that, and maybe they don't even realize here's this gap point, and the data gets to be objective. It's not with judgment, and it's really then a way that we're hitting things very early. And we always talk about the upstream, right? We're catching it before it becomes a mushroom of an issue. And so what I love about this program is this is a great microcosm and a test point that then we can duplicate, right? We've talked a lot about, I think, the programmatic, what you and the teams are trying to do, right? And working with all of these myriad of partners. But our public partners are also key, right? Every resident in New Jersey. And what's so valuable and incredible about this initiative is I think everyone knows a veteran. Everyone, whether it's family, friends, or themselves, has a touch point to this. And I think it's also a great way of breaking down barriers about concept of homelessness. But what can we ask our public to do, right? What can we ask our fellow neighbors and community members to support this effort and really make sure that we're helping with getting our homeless vets to the right place at the right time?
Yeah, sure. So I say the first part is, really leveraging those relationships for the referral, right? Is that if you know somebody who's in a housing crisis, if you know whatever, one of the facets about the online form. So if you go to bvh.dca.nj.gov, right, you don't have to be the veteran. You can fill out the form on behalf of someone.
Oh, excellent!
Right? And you can actually go, and there's no information that's HIPAA protected or anything else like that that's disclosed in the referral form. Right. Simultaneously, you can text vet to vet and say, hey, here's the veteran, here's the number, right? And vet to vet is great, will graciously pass through that information to a VVH standpoint. Similarly, excellent. a lot of the other vendors like Community Hope, who covers, Morris County and the region of the Northwest, right? Carmine's fantastic over there. He's really enabled, right? Kind of an all source collection mechanism of, hey, you can call our hotline, you can email somebody, you can email me, and they'll go and he'll make sure it gets to the right place. And so importantly, it's the information that goes and that's comfortable, but also to being able to say, hey, this veteran might be sleeping in the woods, I'm willing to go out there with you to go and say that. And so it could just be one touch point to go and facilitate that and make that happen. The flip side of that, right, is if we're really going to talk about accelerating veteran housing outcomes, right, we really need to ensure if you are a small landlord, right, and that you have a property that is and you're interested in renting to a veteran who's formerly homeless, or a veteran household, right, that is formerly homeless or housing insecure, right, we would love to talk with you, right? We have a section of the BVH website that should be live here pretty soon, right, that has this whole landlord engagement process where folks can sign up, right, if they know somebody for available units. There's also, we are more than willing to come out to your church group. We're more than willing to come out to your VFW. We're more than willing to come out to your municipal meeting, right? To go and just give a presentation, right?
Or even a podcast studio.
Yeah, exactly.
Yes.
Right. Really just to socialize that message. Because importantly, even when we reach functional zero, which I'm confident we're going to do before the benchmark of July 1 next year, it's really important that kind of the systems of access are driven by human touch, not just, hey, I'm going to call, here's the number to 211, or here's the number to vet, even though that's a great answer if there's no other answer, right? It's those genuine human connections. That's how you resolve what oftentimes is a precipitating cause of folks who didn't have the support networks or the connections to drive it.
Functional zero, I mean, I think it's great that that's within, the near future, right? But what happens, getting there is a huge, huge victory. But once at functional zero, how do you stay there?
Sure. So I'd say, not only is it has to be a continued priority of both departments, both DMAVA and the Department of Community Affairs, and, whomever wins in November, right? This upcoming one. But importantly, this is also a chance for municipalities to lean in. Right. So A4S50, the state affordable housing legislation, right, is really transformative. You can, right, every municipality I've yet to meet, it doesn't matter if you play for the red team or the blue team, I've yet to meet a town council person, an alderman, someone, right, who works in municipal government that doesn't want to build housing for homeless veterans.
Yes.
Right. And so importantly, one of the great things is in many of our production programs to include the Affordable Housing Production Fund, the Affordable Housing Trust Fund, there's a prioritization for veterans housing, for homeless veteran projects. And so as towns are looking to go and engage and really meet those new quotas that they've set forth, right, and go and kind of effectuate the construction of veteran housing, a great idea is, you can engage in a small National Housing Trust Fund project and say there's a VFW that could be converted in your town, right, where the VFW leans in and says, hey, Mayor so-and-so, I'd love to go and change this. We're still going to keep the downstairs as a hall, but we're going to build 6 units. They've
actually done that right next door in the city of Passaic.
Yep.
Yeah.
And because of that, because there's a model and the state's already approved it, and there's already precedent within code and everything else, right? And for other organizations to go and say, hey, here's the MOUs we do, and here's the process that we can replicate, right? Just looking at, we're talking about hypothetically here, but if we took all 564 municipalities, right, we did a four unit project each, right, you're talking about north of 2,000 units of veteran housing.
Incredible.
Right there. And that right there, that is really how you sustain functional zero. Is just like how you end homelessness. You end homelessness with housing.
Well, you may have inspired me to come up with a project right here.
There you go.
In the city of Patterson.
I see it. I see
the wheels are turning.
Yeah, the wheels are turning. So, yeah, and I think, Mike, what is so important, I think, in all of this is that you've got not just, I think, the subject matter expertise perspective on this. Also, I think just your success, right? And I'll tout what you had done in the city of Philadelphia, right? Like going through, I think, the hard work. But, folks may not know, you're a veteran yourself. And I'm always so impressed with you, but I wanted to hear from you, right? To be a veteran yourself, to be a part of this program and to do it in New Jersey, how has that impacted you? Has it been a bit of a full circle moment or even a little bit surreal to kind of feel like you can go back to a community that you had served and worked with, right? In arms and make something so transformative for them?
Oh yeah, totally. I think, one of the being able to really lean in and say, hey, we can do hard stuff.
Yes.
Right. But also to not only can we do hard stuff, we can do hard stuff rapidly.
Right.
And to be able to go and leverage the goodwill of all folks to go and make that happen, regardless of political valence, that really resonates with me. And one of the things that as a veteran going and doing it is, I remember my first tour in Iraq, there was, if you looked at the motley crew that we had, in Delta Company 212 Cav, it was wild. But at the same time, you had people from everywhere across the country, which varying degrees of conservatism, liberalism, the ways of thinking, economic conditions, right? I was kind of the somewhat tropish, like Charlie Sheen college dropout showing up, right? Which is fine.
An essential character.
Yeah.
In the motley crew.
But there's folks that they come from nothing in West Virginia or from Mississippi, right? And that's kind of the escape out of poverty and going and seeing that, hey, even though we're meeting a larger federal policy goal or whatever have you, right? In the moment, this is just about community and us doing stuff together, right? And that we can either make this a brutal time for each other or we can constructively do this together so that while we are doing hard things that are terrible at sometimes, right, we can treat each other, right, like brothers and sisters and make it happen. And catalyzing around that and really kind of taking those values of saying, hey, there's all these systems. And one of the things that we are really brutal at, right, within housing in general and kind of the nonprofit ecosystem larger is the lateral violence that we perpetuate against organizations of, X organization doesn't house people as great as we do, or we provide case management better so much than Y, right? And it's really inhibiting of doing collaborative work together so much that many consultants have built businesses, right? I mean,
optimize that dissension,
exactly,
right?
On that, right? And to be able to go and decrease the lateral violence around just one really clear North Star. It's really kind of a test case and use case of saying, hey, if we can do this for X, then we can do it for Y.
Yeah.
Right. And that we're not going to be able to engage in the same process. We're not going to be able to engage in the same stuff, but some of the social and emotional characteristics of, you know what, if this isn't working and I have a personal emotional reaction to that, I'm going to think and communicate that better because I have to work with this person moving forward.
Right.
And we have to drive towards this goal. And that's something that I loved about the military is that you were literally about to die and you were literally about to do a whole bunch of other stuff, but you were still engaging in ways of communicating and teamwork, right? That kind of got beyond that, right? And if you can do that in such a critical stress situation, then you could do it anywhere else.
Right.
So that's what resonates most with me.
That philosophy, I think, is so well put. And I think it's part of why, folks can hear about this and say, gosh, this is so ambitious. But when you've got that mantra going, that means that it's possible. And before, we have Bob close out, I think this is a great kind of message, right? If we can do this for veterans, why can't we do this for millennial single mothers?
Yeah.
Why can't we do this for, our intergenerational families?
Yep.
And so what I'm so excited about this is that we're going to get this done by, July 2026. And to Bob's point, we get to now then make stronger, more informed arguments and advocacy that if we're doing it for veterans, we can do it for every type of neighbor, every type of resident. So, cheers to you, Mike, for all of that. And I think it's going to be trend setting.
Sure. I echo that. I think that this has been really informative. And the passion that you bring to this work is just so evident. I didn't know about your own status as being a veteran, and it's just clear that you are wholly committed to the success of this project, bringing veterans home. And so thank you for spending time with us today and explaining all of the ins and outs. And I think most importantly, helping us to understand how we are going to get to functional zero in a little bit more than a year.
Yes.
That's something to really celebrate.
Awesome.
So
thanks for having me.
Thank you. And thank you, Guy, as well.
Thank you. Great to have you, Mike.